what matters to Beijing, what matters to the CCP&G personally, is power preservation. And economic growth is no longer part of that conversation. It's about the politics, it's about the security lockdown, it's about setting the narrative. And to a degree, does that make China more dangerous? Certainly. But it also means that no matter what they do, China as an internationally diverse, economically wired country is not long for this world. They're in a position where there's no real clear path forward, so I don't want to say one particular path is the one that will or won't work, because none of them really will. The headline in specific, the idea is that China did Belt and Road, and during COVID, they went and told everybody that these were all loans. And everyone's like, no, these were all totally grants. And the only country that tried to pay them back was Sri Lanka, and we know how that went. The Africans literally laughed the Chinese delegations out of the room when the Chinese asked to be paid back. So, that was $1 trillion wasted. The way I would phrase it isn't so much break legs. Like, people are only, if you pay people to be your friends, they're only your friends as long as you pay them. Taking a harsher stance with these countries is just sure to tank relations. I would say that the warrior wolf diplomacy has done a great job of that already. But there's no country or series of countries that the Chinese can threaten to get what they want. There's also no country or series of countries that they can invade and conquer to get them what they need. They need a bottomless supply of foreign technology and a bottomless supply of foreign consumption. And politically, that was always questionable, but now technically it's no longer even possible. The only country that might be able to help them out is the United States, but that means doing everything the United States' way. And I would even argue that with demographic decline around the world, even if China were to roll over and show the United States its belly, I'm not sure the United States any longer has the capacity to provide the scale of assistance that would help a system that has become as stilted and broken as the Chinese system is internally. I mean, this is a country where Enron-style investment has existed over an order of magnitude higher than it did in the United States, where every economic sector is teetering on the brink of financial dissolution by the way we understand financial rules. It's the world's most dependent country in terms of imports and exports. It's completely dependent on energy imports and raw material exports. And at the end of the day, it has to sell to the American consumer. It's like, I'm not sure we could help if we wanted to. So what matters to Beijing, what matters to the CCP&G personally, is power preservation. And economic growth is no longer part of that conversation. It's about the politics, it's about the security lockdown, it's about setting the narrative. And to a degree, does that make China more dangerous? Certainly. But it also means that no matter what they do, China as an internationally diverse, economically wired country is not long for this world. And that means it's all going to be different for everyone in the not too distant future.
Yeah, and there are always people who just find that statement hard to believe, given the sort of size and power to date of China and that it's centrally controlled. Do you think a military invasion, based on what you just said, of Taiwan is a real threat, or is that a distraction?
I'm going to go out on a limb here. I'm kind of the minority in my world that I really think that the chances of a Taiwan war are low. The way that the Chinese look at this is they've always considered the Russians to be a useful idiot. And if they're thinking of doing something that's going to stir the pot, they kind of nudge the Russians to try it first to see how it goes. And the Taiwan war would fall into that category. So they saw the Ukraine war as a useful proxy. And it hasn't gone the way that they thought. So, number one, they thought the war would be physically easy because, you can walk to Kiev. And the Ukrainians have only been preparing for 8 years. Well, you got to swim to Taipei. And the Taiwanese have been preparing for 45. And so when the war in Ukraine got bogged down, like, crap, assumption one gone. Assumption number two, they thought the Russian weapons were great, so they cloned them. They stole the IP just like they have for everybody else, and cloned $3 trillion worth of them. And they're now having some very, very serious buyer's remorse, although I guess it would be theft remorse. So, assumption two gone. Assumption three is that everyone will just get over it. Well, we now have the most robust sanctions regime in history on the Russians. And it would be a lot worse for China because Russia is a massive exporter of food and energy. China is the world's biggest importer of both. But I think what has really terrified the Politburo are the boycotts. Because here you have private citizens and companies who, without prodding from their governments, have just walked away from, $500 billion of sunk costs. There is no Chinese economic system without international trade, foreign technology, and market access. And the idea that Halliburton has left Russia on moral grounds, there is no moral cover for anyone who wanted to stay in Russia. And the Chinese look at their system like, they were doing a genocide long before the Russians started. This is a country that isn't a democracy. This is a country that cracks down on protesters. This is a country with a horrible record of social management. There's a lot more places for Western ideology to kind of get their claws into if you really want to take it down. And they now know that the West is perfectly capable of doing it.
The financial sanctions against Russia prompted a lot of conversation about the weaponization of the dollar.
Sure.
Would it prompt the Chinese to look to increase trade in yuan, especially when you're talking about oil, petro-yuan, for example? Do you think that there is any possibility of that? Would Middle East producers entertain the idea of pricing oil in yuan? Could they find traction with that?
I don't think there'd be a lot. One of the things we saw with the Russians, and when they tried to move away from the dollar and the euro, they went into whatever currency was available. And honestly, there weren't a lot left at that point. But they did put about $250 billion, if memory serves, into the yuan. And then when they tried to cash it in later, the Chinese were like, nope, we don't want that back. And so the Russians have been forced to move back into the euro and the dollar, just do it really quietly, because there just aren't a lot of options. And then, of course, they fly around a lot of gold. That's really their most reliable way of getting around sanctions. So there's not a lot of options. In the case of the Persian Gulf, there might be some room there, because the Saudis in particular, now that the United States is no longer their largest consumer and no longer their security guarantor, they've been looking for a new friend. The Chinese have come in with a lot of money and a lot of demand. And so the Saudis have done kind of a co-investment thing in industrial plant in China and refineries, just like they did in the United States. And having a yuan trade for that specific sales line, that makes a degree of sense. But keep in mind that if there is a conflict that involves China and the United States, no ships will be coming and going from China. So the Saudis know full well that if you are involved in a hot war with the United States, your tankers don't go there. And so there would be no point in a hot war scenario for the Saudis to do that. Yeah, in a hot war scenario, we are talking about the deindustrialization of the Chinese system and famine within a year, because this is a country that imports 75% of its energy and 75% of the inputs that allow it to grow its own food. If, I don't think there will be, if we do have a conflict over Taiwan that does involve either Japan, the United States, Vietnam, or India, because any one of them can do this, that is the end of China as a modern industrialized power with over 1 billion people.